My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today is part 3 of the podcast's 3-part series on Tang Masters of Poetry. We've done Wang Wei, we've done Li Bai. Today we are going to do Du Fu. Du Fu is the most respected Tang Dynasty poet, even if he is not always the most loved. I think Li Bai gets a bit more love. Du Fu, Chinese friends don't talk about him as much when they're talking about Tang poetry. They revere him. They revere him more, but they talk about him less, which tells you where their hearts are. In that Li Bai podcast I dropped in January, I told this story. I'm going to repeat it. When Steve Durant, a great scholar of the Shiji and a friend of the podcast, when he was back in grad school, back in the 1960s, 1970s, he was taking a class at the University of Washington taught by Helmut Wilhelm. Wilhelm was a famous sinologist, a scholar of the I Ching. He was born in Qingdao. He's German, and he was born in that city because his parents were there, part of the colonial project there in China's greatest beer city. Wilhelm told the class that Professor Durant was in that John Wu, a famous China scholar, said that, quote, anybody who thinks Li Bo is greater than Du Fu is not worth his weight in salt. End quote. Wilhelm then took a drag on his cigarette, held the smoke for a long time, and then blew the smoke over their heads, as he was wont to do apparently, and said, quote, so, my dear students, I, your teacher, am not worth my weight in salt. I think that sentiment, like I said before, is common amongst my Chinese friends, and I'll have to say, for me personally, Du Fu is the Tang poet that I have the most trouble falling in love with. It's hard not to fall in love with all of them, but the one that I have least fallen in love with is Du Fu. And honestly, one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast series on Tang Masters was just to force myself to engage with Du Fu at least a little, challenge myself to read a bit more Du Fu and read about him. Before I did the research for this series, I knew a lot more about Li Bai and Wang Wei than I did about Du Fu. Sure, I knew the basics. I knew that Li Bai was considered the Taoist Tang poet, Wang Wei is considered the Buddhist Tang poet, and Du Fu is considered the Confucian Tang poet. And I knew that Du Fu and his poetry were profoundly affected by the An Lushan Rebellion that occupied China for the latter half of the 750s. And that rebellion nearly destroyed the Tang Dynasty. But other than that, I didn't know all that much about Du Fu. So I actually went to Stephen Owen's great book, The Great Age of Chinese Poetry, which is really the English language source for anyone wanting to understand the Tang poets. In writing my own book, China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read, I actually consulted with Stephen Owen's book. So when I was preparing for this podcast, I went to Owen's book and I made myself read the chapter on Du Fu, and I was impressed by how cool Du Fu came off in Owen's telling. Owen does a great job of representing him. I still like Li Bai and Wang Wei a bit more, but Du Fu has moved up in my estimation, which is exactly what I was hoping for with this podcast. Du Fu is not this dour Confucian poet that I got from my Chinese textbook. He's this fascinating figure and a great poet. So let's dive into his biography, and then we'll talk about the poem that we are going to look at in this podcast, which is called Spring Gazing, Chun Wang. Du Fu was one of the great Tang poets, arguably the greatest poet in Chinese history. He wrote about 1,500 poems that we still have today. Probably wrote more, but 1,500, that's the number that we have today. Chinese literary critics have spent innumerable hours tracing when he wrote these poems. Some we know actually when he wrote them, but some we still don't. Some poems can be read without reference to his life, but others you really have to go back and look at his biography to figure out what he is talking about. And that's particularly true of the An Lushan Rebellion, which I mentioned is really important to both his biography and also to understanding his poetry and how that poetry came to be seen in the Chinese tradition. Because so much of his poetry draws on Chinese history, in Chinese he is often referred to as the shi shi. He is often referred to as the shi shi, that is the poet historian. This poet historian was born in the year 712, so a little bit more than a decade after Li Bai and Wang Wei were born. Unlike Li Bai, who comes to us from an outsider family, Du Fu comes from an old family that has roots in the capital region of Chang'an. Remember, this is back in the Tang. Today we call this city Xi'an, but back in the day it was referred to as Chang'an. Du Fu's family also had some connections to Luoyang, that's a city in modern day Henan that today is a backwater, but throughout a lot of parts of early Chinese history, it was really important. Luoyang is the second capital in the Tang Dynasty. All that's a way of saying Du Fu has this real pedigree. He has these connections both to the current capital and to the Tang's sort of second capital of Luoyang. His granddad was a court poet in the court of Empress Wu Zetian and Emperor Zhongzong. Du Fu was born in the first year of Emperor Xuanzang's reign. Emperor Xuanzang rules from 712 AD to 756 AD, and his rule marks the height of the Tang Dynasty, really, some might argue, of Chinese culture overall. And Du Fu is going to play a big role in creating that apogee of Chinese culture. But the thing about Emperor Xuanzang is that he also played a big role in the downfall of the Tang Dynasty, or at least the crippling of the Tang Dynasty, something that Du Fu is going to witness. We don't know much about Du Fu's youth. He took a journey to the southeast when he was in his teens. He failed the imperial exam, the exam that you have to take to get a job in the government bureaucracy. Later on, after the Tang, that test is going to become more important. And even today, the Gaokaos and other exams are defining features of Chinese life. But at this time in the Tang, the exam was important, but not nearly as important as it would become. So Du Fu fails the imperial exam in either 735 or 736. Then he travels up to the northeast. He settles down in Luoyang for a few years. We don't have much of his poetry from when he was young, as far as we can tell. It's not really until the 740s that we have poems that we can date with certainty. And by this point, Du Fu is writing poetry with a mature poetic voice. So it's almost like, at least in the literary record we have, we don't see this kind of arc of development. It's just Du Fu is straight up, comes at us, starting out at his best, and he never really stops. Du Fu and Li Bai, we do know that the two were friends. There is a poem, Ceng Li Bai, which just means given to Li Bai, where Du Fu seems to suggest that Li Bai is getting raging drunk just as a way to cover up for the vacuousness of Li Bai's own life. So they were quite close. Du Fu could be critical of Li Bai, but they were still friends. In 744, Du Fu met with Li Bai and another literati, another poet, Gao Shi, and they go to visit Li Yong, who is another literati. This Li Yong is quite old. They hang out, spend time together. Chinese literary critics love to compare and contrast Du Fu and Li Bai. And there's the tendency to do more contrasting of Li Bai and Du Fu's style. But when Li Bai and Du Fu were alive, they actually would have seen themselves both as united, writing against the capital poetic tradition as represented by Wang Wei. If you go back to that episode on Wang Wei, you'll remember Wang Wei was the superstar Tang poet during their lifetimes. Even though today Wang Wei is a distant third behind Li Bai and Du Fu, when they were alive, Wang Wei was the dude. Li Bai and Du Fu were definitely second-rate poets, at least in terms of how they were perceived. And they wrote against Wang Wei, and they saw themselves to a certain degree as united, despite the fact that when Chinese literary critics talk about it, they'll focus on differences between Li Bai and Du Fu. But Li Bai and Du Fu themselves would have seen themselves as, to a certain degree, united. Another thing to note about Du Fu, like many elite Chinese men during the imperial period, his dream job was not to be China's greatest poet. Instead, he really wanted to become a bureaucrat in the Tang Dynasty, a cog in the Chinese wheel. And like many of China's greatest poets, his life was defined partially by his failure to get a job. Some of y'all might have heard that from your parents. In 745 AD, after palling around with Li Bai, he returned to Chang'an, the capital, to go fishing for a job as a bureaucrat. Back in the Tang, like I said, the imperial exam was not as important as it would become later on in the Song Dynasty and even today. Getting a job was more about connections and politics and less about the exam itself. So in 747, the emperor actually says, hey, I want to do a special exam for everybody who's already failed an exam because we don't have enough great guys working as bureaucrats. But one of China's top bureaucrats, Li Linfu, he didn't actually want to let people who had already failed an exam take the special exam and get these special spots. So he held the exam. But then Li actually decided that no one passed. So Du Fu takes that special exam, but it's not like he gets a job from it. Li Linfu told the emperor, no one worthy of being a bureaucrat passed this special exam. So again, getting a job in the Tang Dynasty was about politics. It was about connections. In 751, Du Fu wrote 3 poems dedicated to the emperor. The emperor liked them, and Du Fu then got for a job the old-fashioned way, that is by kissing up to the big man at the top. So he writes these poems. Du Fu gets the chance to take a different special exam for a government job, and of course he passes because the emperor wanted him to pass. But again, this is where politics comes up. He had to wait to be assigned a position. So he got the check mark, the all clear. Yes, you can become a government bureaucrat. But in the Tang, you would get a position, but you might actually wait years to be sent off to take up that position. So you could be sitting there for so long and still not get a real job. That's what happened to Du Fu. He never actually really got his position. Why? We don't know exactly, but it was probably the fact that he had connections to these people that bureaucrats high up in the Tang didn't like. Remember, I mentioned that Du Fu and Li Bai went to see a guy named Li Yong, an old poet that they were just hanging out with. It may have actually been that lots of the top level Chinese bureaucrats denied Du Fu the chance to take up his job because he had connections to Li Yong, who they hated. We really don't know, but that's a theory that Stephen Owen suggests might be the case. In 754 AD, Du Fu actually gets a position, but it's such a crap position. It's so low in the hierarchy that he says, no, I don't want it. As a reward, he's given a position in a shadow government of the crown prince. So he's not given a real position in the real government, but he gets a position of the guy who is next in line to take over once Emperor Shenzong dies. But by that time, the earth-shaking event that would come to define the Tang Dynasty had already begun. An Lushan, who is a guy who is a Turk or a Sogdian, An Lushan was not ethnically Han Chinese, but remember, the Tang Dynasty is this period where multicultural China flourishes. He's not Han Chinese. He's either a Turk or a Sogdian. We don't really know. Chinese sources oftentimes say he is a Turk or his mother was, get this, a Turkish witch casting spells and stuff. We don't know who his biological dad was, but he is adopted by a guy with the last name An, who's probably a Sogdian. These Sogdians are just basically think of them as like Iranians or Persians. They're a group of traders whose homeland is in Central Asia that were very, very important to Silk Road trade. An Lushan, whether or not he was a Turk or a Sogdian, he was a big deal in the Tang even before the rebellion where he almost overthrew the Tang. The emperor liked him. The emperor actually paid for a house in the capital for An Lushan to have. But An Lushan had a beef with a guy in the government, the top guy in the government, Yang Guozhong. This is the lead bureaucrat in the Tang Dynasty. And he also had a beef with Yang Guozhong's cousin, whose name is, well, we always call her Yang Guifei. Guifei is just a way to refer to a valuable concubine, the sexual partner of the emperor, who's not his wife, but is still valued, particularly for her physical attributes. So Yang Guozhong did not like An Lushan, and he basically started talking bad about An Lushan. And with the cousin right there saying nasty things about An Lushan during pillow talk to the emperor, things were not looking good for An Lushan. So An Lushan, worried about being killed, worried about being thrown out of office, he took his military forces and rebelled. He took Luoyang, and then he charges into Chang'an. The emperor of China, the most powerful man in the world at the time in 755, has to flee his capital. The troops blamed Yang Guifei and Yang Guozhong for starting the rebellion by being unreasonably provocative with An Lushan. And as they are retreating, the troops demand that if the emperor wants their continued protection, he has to execute Yang Guifei and Yang Guozhong, which he did. The civil war sets off spouts of violence across Tang China. Massive numbers of people died. Many lives were ruined. Du Fu is the guy who wrote the poetic history of those ruined lives. Much of his work is dominated by depictions of the destruction that the rebellion wrought on China and on much of his personal life. There are really touching portrayals of Du Fu being separated from his family and coming back to them. And when he gets back to them, they're wearing nothing but paper as clothes. His children are half starved, wearing dirty clothes. Here's a translation of a really, really long poem called Beizheng that Du Fu wrote coming back home after having crossed enemy lines. After a year, I got back to my little cabin, and my wife's clothes had 100 patches. The baleful cries echo back the sound of pine trees. The sad spring quietly sobs with us. The son I have cherished all my life, his face is whiter than snow. I see his backsides and wail. He is all dirty and greasy, his legs with no socks. My two little girls are on the front of the bed. It only goes past her knees once they have had its holes patched up. Her embroidered ocean pattern dress rips at the waves. The old embroidery has been patched up, all crooked. The mythical dragon and the purple phoenix, they're sewn upside down in this crappy clothing. Me, an old man, I feel horrible, and for several days I puke and have the squirts. So this is just a small bit of this poem. This poem is really long. It's 840 Chinese characters, so that translates in English to something like 3,000 or 4,000 words. I'm not going to translate it all, but you can just see how his poetry takes this political tragedy and makes it concrete. It's not just a bunch of dudes fighting. It is children without clothing. It's starved family members. It's Du Fu himself getting sick and having the squirts, that is diarrhea. Uh, the war is made real in the bodies of these people that Du Fu writes poetry about. Du Fu has a lot of these longer narrative poems like this. He's famous for them. One of the reasons I've struggled with Du Fu is partially because his poems are just so freaking long. Yeah, I love short Chinese poems. Chinese poetry has this narrative economy that is just like, it punches you with every word. Not Du Fu. Li Bai, yes. Wang Wei, yes. And some of Du Fu's poetry, like the one we're going to take a look at in a second, it does that. But these longer poems are just really hard to read, really hard to translate. And so that's one of the things I struggle with Du Fu, which is why I'm going to take a look at a different poem, the one that I mentioned before. It's one of his shorter poems. It's about destruction caused by the rebellion and how this destruction nearly destroys the country. The poem is called Spring Gazing, Chun Wang. All right, here we go. The country is broken. The rivers and mountains are still there. The grass and trees in the city's springtime grow deep. Stirred by the movement, I sprinkle the flowers with my tears. Frustrated by having to leave, the birds are alarmed. For these 3 months, the beacon fires atop the peaks have been lit. A letter home is worth $1,000,000. I rub my white hair, making it thinner. So thin that my hair almost cannot hold a hairpin. As always, I'll post the translation on the website along with the original. Let's break this poem down now. So the first line, there's this contrast. The country is broken, but the rivers and mountains abide. We have this feeling that the political world has been torn apart and no longer exists. The country is broken, but nature survives. And I just want to make a side note here. Some of the commentaries written about this poem say that this word that I'm translating as country, guo, does not actually mean country here. Guo in modern Chinese is just guojia, that's country. They say, the commentaries say that we should actually interpret this as guodu, which is just literally the country's capital, Chang'an. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I just don't buy those commentaries. It makes sense to me to refer to this as country. But just to make sure I'm doing my due diligence, and y'all know that I have actually talked with people about translating these poems. Okay, back to the poem. The country is broken, but the land and territory is like what it was before. The rivers and mountains are still there. In the next line, we see vegetation blooming in the springtime. So it seems initially like nature is not affected, but when you actually zoom in, you see that in line 3 and 4, nature is to a certain degree being affected. The flowers are having tears sprinkled on them. The birds are somehow alarmed. So nature still abides, but it is affected by the political disorder. In the second half of this poem, we turn away from nature, and Du Fu, unlike Li Bai and Wang Wei, he doesn't do nature. Of all the Tang poets, he talks the least about nature. So Du Fu, in the second half of the poem, he turns and talks about the fighting. For 3 months, the beacon fires have been lit. The beacon fires, this is a series of fires that were lit along these corridors that allowed for long distance communication quickly. They didn't have email, of course, they didn't have fax machines, but you could send a message. Almost always, the government would send some sort of urgent message using these beacon fires, and they would work similar to the way smoke signals work, not exactly, but similar. So those urgent messages have been being sent back and forth for 3 months because of the intensity of this rebellion, so that the needs of the state here and the way that war is being waged, that sets out that line 5, but it's immediately contrast with the personal private needs of Du Fu. Du Fu sees imperial information passing via these beacon fires, but he is cut off from news of what is happening to his family. A letter to him would be worth this incalculable sum. The translated as $1,000,000. The original Chinese is like 10,000 pieces of gold. It really just means a ton of money. That's all. Now, the last 2 lines of the poem, lines 7 and 8 in my translation, we've gone from nature to the human world. We're talking about beacon fires. We're talking about his family. Now we get even more personal as it can get. The effects that this rebellion and the anxiety it's caused are having on Du Fu's body. The poet says he scratched his white hair so much that it's gotten really thin, so thin that he's not able to put it up in the hairpin that Chinese scholars traditionally wore as a sign of their status. So he's aged with all this chaos and all this war around him. The stress that he has had to carry has made him balder. After this explication de text, I think that's a good place to end this podcast. It's gone on long for the podcast I normally do, just with me. Next time, we are going to be having a special guest. We'll be talking about Mongol stuff, but this is as good of a place as any to end the podcast. If you're interested in the poem, check out the website where I post my translation along with the original, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. If you haven't already, check out my book, China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read. Buy it from my publisher. It's also available on Amazon. You can go to chinasbackstory.com, or you can just Google China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read. That is it for me. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.